So this is the second presentation that is tied to the Kennedy policy chart that you submitted for me. Maybe you watched the first presentation on Kennedy's domestic policies. This particular PowerPoint presentation is dealing with Kennedy's foreign policy. Remember, a domestic policy is something that, or a president's policies at home, while a foreign policy is dealing with relationships and policies abroad, like President Eisenhower and President Truman and President Roosevelt. The focus here is going to be Cold War tensions and communism. Kennedy is going to have some bumpy roads with his domestic policy. We talked about how he was only really successful with the space program, but really struggled in getting other areas passed through Congress. On the other hand, here with his foreign policy, Kennedy, while there's a little blunder in the beginning, is actually going to be fairly successful with his foreign policy. So there are five areas, six if you want to include Vietnam, where we look at Kennedy's foreign policy. Now, keep in mind, he was elected in 1960, was inaugurated in January of 1961, dies in November of 1963. So he's not even in office 3 full years. When he's killed. Yet he had so much going on, which is one of the reasons why his presidency is so important. So the first event that we're going to talk about here is what we call the Bay of Pigs invasion. And you can see on the map here that the Bay of Pigs is a body of water out here in the Caribbean Sea off the coast of Cuba. Okay, and you see Cuba is just a hop, skip, and a jump from Florida, okay, particularly Miami. Okay? So a little background here. We have Fidel Castro, okay, as the leader of Cuba. Now, Fidel Castro was actually pretty poor in Cuba, and prior to his overthrow, the government in Cuba was fairly friendly with the United States, but it's mostly because the United States put them in place and controlled them. And Fidel Castro and his supporters were not okay with this, so they led a revolution in 1959 to overthrow that dictatorship and to establish his own government. Now, when he did that, the United States broke relations with him. And so from 1959, when Eisenhower was the president, we stopped having relationship with Cuba. And because of this, Fidel Castro reaches out to the new Soviet Union leader, Nikita Khrushchev, who I had told you about in the election of 1960 PowerPoint. He becomes the leader of the Soviet Union after Joseph Stalin dies. So Fidel Castro and Nikita Khrushchev become like buddy-buddy. They really do like each other. Well, when Kennedy becomes president, in the first couple of months of his presidency, he becomes aware of a covert plan or a secret plan that Eisenhower's people had proposed to overthrow Fidel Castro. And Kennedy thought that this would be a great idea. He thought that, well, I don't have a lot of political experience. Many people are questioning my place as the leader of the free world. So this would be a great opportunity to kind of show off how strong I really can be. And so what this plan entailed was the new CIA, or Central Intelligence Agency. The Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, was in charge of orchestrating this plan to overthrow Castro. And the idea would be that they would train a group of Cubans who were already exiled by Castro. I mean, exiled means kicked out of the country. Exiled by Castro, already don't get along with Castro. The CIA would train these guys to overthrow Castro. And the hope would be, since the rumor was that people, all of the people of Cuba didn't like him, that more people would join in this mini revolution and overthrow Castro. So by training a small group of exiled, the hope would that be more locals would come and join him. There were a lot of people in Kennedy's inner circle here that did not like this plan and thought that, early in 1961, just a few months into Kennedy's presidency, that this would be such a good idea. Very few people thought that. Kennedy, on the other hand, thought that it was the best thing to do in stopping the spread of communism at this point. This picture up here that you see is Fidel Castro. Okay, and this is Nikita Khrushchev. And you can see with this picture here that they very much look buddy-buddy. And keep that in mind, even though it has nothing to do with the overthrow of Castro, the relationship between Castro and Khrushchev will be very important for the future. So Kennedy launches what becomes known as the Bay of Pigs invasion on April 17th, 1961. And we call it that invasion because that's where they were going to be landing those Cuban exiles. Well, this was a complete and total disaster, absolute disaster. So the exiles, the Cuban troops, okay, that the CIA had trained were ill-equipped. The airstrikes did not come on time. Okay, so these poor Cuban exiles are basically fighting blind. The locals that they thought were going to help the effort didn't participate because they were so scared of Fidel Castro. And then on top of that, Castro's military was way too big and way too strong. This was a complete disaster, hopeless, clumsy, and incompetent. And when this happens, Kennedy has no choice but to admit defeat. There was no silver lining to come out of this invasion here. And the effects of this are that it really showed the world that Kennedy was inexperienced as a leader. And it exposed our beliefs and hope to overthrow Cuba, overthrow Fidel Castro. And this really puts a bad taste in people's mouths about the United States, that we lost a little bit of credibility and we lost a little bit of prestige because we were willing to use Cuban exiles and then not help them, and then overthrow a leader that didn't really do anything to us at the time. So one of the things that you had to do in your chart after you summarized the event and the outcome is you had to determine if this particular event helped or hurt President Kennedy. And more than any other event on this chart, this one should be pretty obvious that it hurt President Kennedy's credibility as a president. It showed his inexperience. It showed his lack of understanding of how to handle these situations. And in fact, Kennedy will spend literally the rest of his life coming back from this defeat. That leads us to the second event, which is called the Berlin Crisis. Again, JFK is trying to come back from this, coming back, fight back communism after the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, this particular instance takes us back to Europe and once again back to the city of Berlin. Now, if you remember from the end of, or during the Cold War unit, the end of World War II, Germany was split into 4 sections. Okay? You had a piece for each of the victors of World War II. Well, eventually the 3 Western powers combined their 3 pieces and we have West Germany, but the Soviets refused to give up their piece. So then we have East Germany, and then the same thing happens to Berlin. Well, you learned with the Berlin airlift that the Soviet Union was trying to take control of Berlin, and Truman had found a way to protect West Berlin by dropping supplies. The Soviets were also trying to find ways to keep the East Berliners and the East Germans from getting into the West. And this was becoming an increasingly tense situation for everybody involved. Nobody wants to start a war over Berlin. So both sides were trying to find ways to resolve this conflict, and the USSR was trying to find new ways to strengthen the division. Well, JFK decided to have a meeting with Nikita Khrushchev. Okay, in June of 1961, so you're looking at maybe 2 months after the Bay of Pigs invasion, keeping in mind Nikita Khrushchev and Fidel Castro are very, very good friends. They decided to have a meeting to talk about Berlin. Well, once again, Kennedy's inexperience was highlighted here as Khrushchev just completely annihilated him in the meeting, and it really in terms of what to do with Berlin. Okay, this really ticked off Kennedy. This meeting that went very poorly with Kennedy and Khrushchev was really set off a spark in Kennedy to take action. Kennedy knew that Khrushchev wasn't messing around when it came to what to do with Berlin. And Kennedy thought, well, if Khrushchev is successful in taking over West Berlin, what's going to stop him from taking over the rest of Germany and then ultimately the rest of Western Europe? So Kennedy decided to increase defense spending. $3 billion in 1961 is billions, okay, over $30 billion in defense today, for Americans to build fallout shelters, for increasing the draft, for bringing reserves to active duty. Basically, Kennedy had a full mobilization of the military. To the Soviets, what does this look like? Well, it looks like Kennedy's getting ready to go to war. Now, is Kennedy really going to go to war over Berlin? No. But to the Soviets, it looks like he's getting ready to do so. Well, Khrushchev, he doesn't want to fight a war over Berlin either. And so what his government decides to do to solve the Berlin crisis is to build a wall. Now, you've probably heard of the Berlin Wall before. The Berlin Wall begins construction in the summer of 1961. This becomes a literal division of capitalism versus communism, but it becomes that symbol of the Iron Curtain. Really, it's a physical symbol of what we had already talked about with the Iron Curtain, of separating our beliefs from theirs. But through Kennedy's actions and then Khrushchev's reaction, both sides found a way to avoid fighting over Berlin. And this particular wall will actually stay standing and come down in November of 1989 as the Cold War is coming to a close. Now, in June of 1963, a couple of years later, Kennedy does go to Germany, to West Germany. He delivers a speech, basically saying that he's there for Berlin. And that as a free person, he takes pride in the words that he is a Berliner, that he's there to protect all citizens in this world of freedom. So again, you're supposed to evaluate how successful was Kennedy here. Did this help or hurt him? This had the beginnings of it possibly hurting him because he didn't know how to handle Khrushchev in a meeting. But ultimately, his spark, his action to mobilize the military helped find a way to avoid fighting over Berlin. So this is actually going to be a good thing for Kennedy. It shows that he will and that he can stand up to the Soviet Union and stop the spread of communism without starting a war. Okay, so remember how we said Khrushchev and Castro were really good friends? Okay, that becomes especially important in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, so this particular event becomes an opportunity for Kennedy to redeem himself in Cuba. We said the Bay of Pigs invasion was detrimental, really, to his foreign policy at that point in time. And like I said, they were friends. Khrushchev and Castro were friends. And once it was evident through the Bay of Pigs invasion that we were trying to overthrow him, Fidel Castro begins asking Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviet Union for support. And so the USSR willingly helps Cuba. And what they start to do is they start building missile bases on Cuban soil. And they were discovered in October of 1962 by American spy planes. Okay. Are they going to shoot us? Probably not, but the concern is that we have these missile bases 90 miles from American soil, and this becomes very concerning for the American people. These missiles were installed for intimidation. They were meant to show Kennedy not to mess with Cuba. And at the same time, they were in retaliation for missiles that were put in Turkey during the Truman Doctrine, way back when you learned about the Truman Doctrine. We had missile bases in Turkey to threaten and intimidate the Soviet Union. So this was like equaling or leveling the playing field. So Kennedy is trying to figure out, what do we do here? Okay? How do we handle this situation? He's a little nervous to invade because of what happened last time. And you have to be careful because now you're dealing with weapons. Okay, so Kennedy had a couple of options. The first option is to negotiate with Khrushchev. Now, with the last incident with Berlin, negotiating didn't go so well. Okay, and on top of that, he was concerned that he would look too weak. Okay, our neighbor has missiles pointing right at us, and all you're going to do is talk about it. That wasn't necessarily the best option. He also considers invading Cuba, very much like the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm sorry, the Bay of Pigs invasion. Well, you don't want to invade, because if you invade, you start a war, and now we're dealing with nuclear weapons here. We don't want to do that. The third option is to blockade Cuba. Blockade means to physically surround them with military or with ships. Okay, physically cut them off, cut off their missile deliveries. But the term blockade, okay, is an act of war. So you have the same issues that you have with invading Cuba. It's considered an act of war. You could bomb the missile sites and blow them up, but again, could be considered an act of war. So Kennedy wasn't sure what to do. All of these options had risks. They either made him look weak or lead us to nuclear war, and Kennedy was very nervous. So Kennedy does a couple of things. Okay, again, these situations really lit a spark in Kennedy. He prepares his troops for an invasion of Cuba. Is he going to invade them? I don't know. It depends on Khrushchev, but at least he was ready if it came to that point. And on October 22nd, 1962, he goes on national television and tells the American people that the Cubans have missiles pointing at the United States. He wanted to keep the American people in the loop, and once again, utilizing television. Now, his decision, of all of those options, his decision is really genius. Okay, he sets up a blockade. He doesn't use the term blockade because, like I said, a blockade is an act of war. What he uses is the term quarantine, which you are all familiar with what that means, okay, these days. But he uses the term naval quarantine, basically keeping the Cubans by themselves. And he does this by casually sending his ships out to hang out in the Atlantic, in the Gulf, in the Caribbean, to keep the Cubans where they are, to quarantine. Again, he's not using the term blockade because a blockade is an act of war. Okay, so it's just a play on words. And he basically puts the ball in Khrushchev's court. He tells Nikita Khrushchev, eliminate this threat, meaning the weapons, tell the Cubans to take them down. And he makes it very clear that Khrushchev's actions, his response, would determine our actions. Again, he puts the ball in Khrushchev's court. Kennedy has no intention of firing the first shot, but our actions are going to depend on how Khrushchev responds to us in this moment. So in October of 1962, the world literally waits and waits for the possibility of a nuclear war. You learned about fallout shelters and duck and cover and things like that in the Cold War unit. Well, these were those moments where the Americans were actually practicing for the possibility of actually having to do it, because we didn't know what was going to happen. So here's Cuba. Okay, you see Cuba there. 1, 2, 3, 4. These are the missile sites. Okay, this is where we had our quarantine. Okay, again, we don't call it a blockade, we called it a quarantine, so we didn't have an active war, but we had our ships hanging out there in the Gulf, in the Caribbean, and the Atlantic, and we waited because the Cubans were going to be getting everything from the Soviet Union. So we waited as the Soviets made their way towards our ships. So it would have been face to face with them. What we decide to do, like we said, depends on what Khrushchev does. And what Khrushchev does is he calls the ships back. They turn around and they go back. So again, as the Soviet ships approach the blockade, they reverse directions. Disaster is avoided. Okay, Kennedy found a way to avoid a war over missiles in Cuba. Now, this was a big success for Kennedy. However, it became known that the Cubans were still building the sites. Now, even though Khrushchev called his ships back, the Cubans were still building the missile sites. So basically, Kennedy gives Khrushchev another threat, again, puts the ball in his court, and Khrushchev comes back with, he says he will remove the missiles from Cuba if JFK removes his quarantine and takes the missiles away from Turkey. Okay, so again, we would be leveling the playing field. Khrushchev will take away some missiles if Kennedy takes away his missiles, and Kennedy publicly accepts. JFK has redeemed himself in Cuba and basically becomes an international hero, showing that we can stand up to Khrushchev, we can stand up to the Soviet Union, and we can avoid a war. Some very positive effects that came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It reduces the risk of nuclear war, and both Kennedy and Khrushchev develop a hotline of communication, meaning if the two guys ever hear any rumblings that our two countries are not going to get along over something, they have a direct line to each other to talk it out. Okay? That was one thing that made Khrushchev very different from Joseph Stalin. He was willing to coexist. He was willing to talk about it. And so they had this hotline of communication. They also came up with a test ban treaty. I like these two quotes from Khrushchev and Kennedy. Khrushchev said, "The two most powerful nations have been squared off against each other, each with its finger on the button." And Kennedy says, "It is insane that two men sitting on opposite sides of the world should be able to decide to bring an end to civilization." The point is, they were saying that neither country should really have this power, or neither person should really have this power. So they spent a number of days negotiating and came up with a treaty that will limit the test of nuclear weapons. Okay, and again, here's a picture here showing you Kennedy and Khrushchev, and then I personally like that political cartoon of both of them sitting on their hydrogen bombs and arm wrestling. So did Kennedy's actions in the Cuban Missile Crisis help or hurt him? This absolutely helped him and restored his credibility as a leader. Okay, the next two topics are organizations that Kennedy proposes. The first is the Alliance for Progress. The United States and the Soviet Union had been constantly competing for alliances, specifically in third world nations. Communism thrives on chaos. Countries that are in chaotic states tend to flock to communism because they feel that communism will protect them and make them better. Of all areas in the world, Kennedy was most concerned about the Latin American countries because that they were in our hemisphere. So he wanted to protect our half of the globe. Like I said, the poorer nations supported communism. So Kennedy proposed the formation of what becomes known as the Alliance for Progress. And the idea here is that if, kind of like what Truman did with Greece and Turkey and the Marshall Plan, that if we can provide money to these poorer countries, they can rebuild themselves. They can build stable governments, they can help the people, and they will be able to stabilize and become friends with the United States. So it's really a win-win. Well, it sounds pretty good, $20 billion over 10 years to promote this economic development. But the reality is the federal government was only going to give them a couple billion, and then they were responsible for providing the rest of the money. So it never actually panned out very well. And because of what Kennedy actually was doing in Cuba initially with the Bay of Pigs invasion, many Latin American countries actually were skeptical of him and what his real motives were. He thought maybe that they were trying to, Kennedy was trying to take over their countries, not help them. So the program never actually reached its potential, but at least the intention was there from Kennedy's part. And then the other organization that Kennedy proposed was the Peace Corps. And it's pronounced corps, not corpse. Okay, a corpse is a dead body, a corps is an organization. And so again, this is really targeting third world countries, just like the Alliance for Progress. Again, communism thrives on chaos and is able to, and again, these poor countries need to rebuild to stabilize. And so Kennedy hoped, well, you know, if my idea with money isn't working, maybe I can send people there. And so the Peace Corps was basically a group of volunteers who went to these third world countries, particularly in Africa and Asia, and they started teaching, and they were providing medication and developing infrastructure. And bringing modern technology to these places. And the goal was if we can increase the standard of living and we can help these countries stabilize, then the governments will take care of their people and they'll have the United States to thank. So as far as his actions in these organizations, did it help or hurt his credibility? This one's really either way. Okay, you could argue either way. Some people said it hurt. Some people like to say it hurts his credibility because he has ulterior motives. And they were not very successful. Other people are saying that it's a good thing because it's showing that he's making attempts to help stabilize poorer countries. So it's really whatever you think, as long as you can back it up. And then lastly is Kennedy's policy in Vietnam. And we're not going to go into a lot of detail here because we'll do this more. You'll see this slide again with Vietnam. But basically, the conflict in Vietnam will escalate during Kennedy's presidency. Vietnam is going to be split north and south, just like Korea. In fact, almost immediately following the Korean War, the Civil War in Vietnam will start, with the North being communist and the South being anti-communist. Kennedy vows to help stop the spread of communism, just like containment says for every president. So that means we are going to help South Vietnam. Well, the leader of South Vietnam is a guy named Ngo Dinh Diem, and Kennedy vows to help him. He was not a very good leader, and we'll talk more about him as when we get to the Vietnam unit. But basically, initially, Kennedy sends 16,000 of what we would call advisors, meaning troops, but troops that aren't officially fighting, if that makes sense, by the end of 1963. And then because he doesn't like Ngo Dinh Diem, actually encourages South Vietnamese military leaders to overthrow and assassinate him. So Kennedy's presidency will definitely escalate the conflict in Vietnam, although our actual physical fighting in Vietnam won't happen until President Johnson. Okay. So overall here, how would you rate Kennedy's foreign policy? You were supposed to answer these questions at the end of your chart. Again, this is an overall. So taking into consideration everything from the Bay of Pigs invasion and moving forward. I don't necessarily care how you answer this question. You could give them an A, you could give them a D, you could give them a C plus, I don't care. But what I care about is, can you back it up? Do you have, he had a good presidency because he stopped the spread of communism and he avoided war, or he had a failed presidency because his motives weren't pure, etc. So as long as you can back it up, you can use that as your response. So that concludes this presentation of Kennedy's policies. The next presentation that you'll watch is new information, but it's dealing with the assassination of President Kennedy.